Armed conflict has been with us since the dawn of civilization. Archaeologists have unearthed evidence of armies as far back as 10,000 BC. Military history has always existed on a grand scale, with legendary battles fought on land, sea, and air. From ancient daggers to modern medals of honor, in expert hands, these relics reveal the stories of those who are no longer here to speak for themselves. Join us as we unlock the secrets of Militaria. Today on Militaria, we will look at a uniform worn by trailblazer Sheila Hellstrom, Navy memorabilia from the Second World War, as well as a firearm dating back to the War of 1812. Ken Chislett looks at a rare Flintlock pistol, one of only 4,986 that were ever made.
Unfortunately, this gun was a children's toy for most of its life in my family. It was used for Halloween costumes.
Mark People looks at a uniform that belonged to Sheila Hellstrom, the first female Brigadier General in the Canadian Forces.
The numbers that she was hitting, the places that she was going, the jobs that she was doing were all very, very significant.
Andrew Moss looks at a grouping of medals and a sword that date back to the German Navy of World War II.
There are people that say, why don't we just throw all this stuff in the garbage? What do you say to those people?
Well, I say to them that would be a mistake because it's history. My name is John Burchell. I'm from over on the North Shore of Nova Scotia, born in Truro. The items I brought in today were obtained directly from the original owner, Walter Leopold, from northern Germany, where I worked for the federal government back in the 70s.
Among the Nazis' deadly weapons of war, few were as feared as the U-boat, and deservedly so. These silent killers prowled beneath the waves, searching for victims and striking without warning or mercy. U-boats preyed on the Allied merchant convoys delivering cargo to supply the war effort. Over the course of the Second World War, they torpedoed and sank close to 3,000 ships. But as the Allies developed countermeasures and new tactics, the tide turned. By the end of the war, 2/3 of the U-boat fleet was at the bottom of the ocean, along with 28,000 German submariners. They suffered a 75% casualty rate, the highest of all German forces.
You've brought in a grouping that is pretty spectacular.
It's a grouping of medals, insignia, and edged weapons that belonged to a member of the German War Navy, the Kriegsmarine, in World War II. He wanted to find a home for them. He didn't simply want to sell them on the open market. I had run an ad in a local newspaper where I lived in Germany at the time, the community where he resided. He contacted me, told me he had some things for sale, possibly. And after 3 meetings with him, he felt comfortable letting all of his articles go to myself as a collector, where he knew they would be held together and respected and treated properly.
Wow, a spectacular grouping. You've got the officer's sword in its original leather scabbard, which is pristine. The dagger with the original portopee. Over on the side here, you've got U-boat badge, and you've got the Iron Cross second class, the U-boat clasp in bronze. You've got the High Seas Fleet War badge. And over here, you've got the very, very rare U-boat clasp in silver, which was only issued in the last few weeks of the war. And you've got the document that goes with that as well.
Yes.
Iron Cross first class and some other insignia, including his traditions badge, it looks like, which is exceedingly rare. You've got the summer uniform eagle as well. Just an incredible grouping of material all to one individual.
I think the controversy sometimes that people have, and I think I can understand that, but perhaps mistaken, is the appearance of the national symbol of the National Socialist Party, of the eagle and the swastika, because that signifies, of course, the bad things of the Third Reich.
Unfortunately, before the Third Reich came around, it was a symbol of good luck, of peace, and was turned into, what we know today as the swastika.
Yes, they didn't all have something directly to do with the bad features of the Third Reich and the Nazi regime. Nonetheless, the items that I collect and the other parts of that regime are all history, and history is not to be buried if we're going to learn from it and prevent future occurrences.
Well, the grouping that you brought for us, John, is very pertinent to Halifax, as we said previously, because the gentleman in question was a submariner. In 1939, Hitler actually had a plan to make the German Navy as large as the British Navy. He wanted to match the amount of ships 1 per 1. It's called Plan Z. With the outbreak of war in 39, that was all shelved because they figured that it would take until 1944 to be able to produce that many ships. They opted instead for submarine warfare and to allocate a lot of the resources to these submarines. Basically, what ended up happening is all these submarines were sort of unleashed on the Atlantic in the beginning of the war. But what happened eventually with the ASDIC, which was radar, the British had figured out a way to tell exactly where those U-boats are, and they could pick them up on radar. And of course, we also had the German codes, which had been broken, and so they were able to figure out where these U-boats were going to be. They weren't as successful. They started sinking a lot of U-boats, and that's really where there was a lot of, loss of life amongst the U-boat crews, because towards the end of the war, a U-boat had almost zero chance of returning from patrol. As you well know, casualty rates in the war were 80–90%, so most of these individuals never survived the war, which makes your grouping all the more impressive. And that you were able to meet the individual and get that history out of them.
Yes.
So most German submariners had 80–90% casualty rate. Towards the end of the war, most U-boats that were going out on patrol were not returning. I think we can take away from John's contribution today the fact that I look at something like that and I always think about the incredible loss of life. They're beautiful artifacts. They're really well made, but at the end of the day, it really speaks to the human tragedy that war is and the loss of life. John, I have to say I would love to be the caretaker of this. And you've done a fantastic job in keeping it in excellent condition. I have to say, just thought I'd ask, what are your plans? What's your ideas on that, on being the custodian of this?
So it'll stay with me for the time being, respecting the owner's previous request that it be kept together, which of course is what I want to do and what should happen, rather than have going out piecemeal here or there.
It should always be kept intact like that, yeah.
So whether it stays in my family to one of my grandsons, or whether it goes to another collector, it would have to be someone that, like you, that would appreciate keep it together.
Yes, absolutely.
I wouldn't want to see it sold piecemeal on the market. For the moment, it stays as one of my prime pieces of my collection.
What stood out for me most with John is his passion for collecting, and it's people like that that protect and preserve our heritage and our history.
Coming up on Militaria.
The numbers that she was hitting, the places that she was going, the jobs that she was doing were all very, very.
My name is Cheryl Lamerson, and I've brought in a uniform of Brigadier General Sheila Hellstrom, the first female general in the Canadian Forces. She was a role model from the get-go. In 1987, if you were a woman in the military in 1987, you knew who Sheila Hellstrom was.
Like most nations, Canada was slow to welcome women into its military. Midway through World War II, Canada created women's auxiliaries to the Army, Navy, and Air Force. Initially, women were restricted to roles such as nurses, cooks, seamstresses, and secretaries. That eventually expanded to include jobs as parachute riggers, laboratory assistants, drivers, mechanics, electricians, and code breakers. But combat roles remained forbidden. More progress came through the 1970s, and then in the 80s, after Parliament passed the Human Rights Act and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, combat roles were finally opened to women in 1989, with the exception of serving on submarines, which opened in 2001.
So, Cheryl, I'd like to welcome you to the show here today. The uniforms here, we've got the different variations in color, and also, of course, the texture and the changes. Women's uniforms changed, of course, in the time of this period as well, too.
Right. By 1982, when they come out with this uniform, for whatever reason, they've changed the color slightly. It's still dark green, but they've changed the color. It's a longer jacket. The skirt had a little bit of a flare on it, and oh my gosh, it was heaven. We got issued pants. It was the first time that the dress uniform, women were allowed to wear pants. And that meant when you went on parade, you could be wearing pants. In this uniform, when you went on parade, if there were men on parade, you pretty much split the seams on your skirt because you couldn't keep up with the men unless you were breaking the skirt.
We're going to talk about something a bit bigger than the uniforms here. We're going to talk about Canada's first Brigadier General.
Yes, first female Brigadier General, Sheila Ann Hellstrom.
You worked for her, right?
I did. So there were just a lot of firsts throughout her career. She was the first to go to staff college. I think she might have been the first woman to go to staff school as well. In the late 70s, she was supervising what was called the Swinter Trials, service women in non-traditional environments and roles. And she was also involved when the decision was made that it wouldn't be a trial whether women went into combat or not, because women had already proven that they could do the jobs. It would be an implementation. Even as she retired, she was still coming back with the Minister's Advisory Board on gender integration, I think it was called. I think that most women in the military, depending on their occupation, depending on their role, could look at Sheila's history and find something in that history and say, oh, I wouldn't have been doing that if she hadn't done that. I know there were jobs that I had that I would not have had if she hadn't had them before me. You know, she led the way.
She worked her way from an entry-level position where she joined after university to the highest levels that a woman had achieved at that point. It took her 30 years to do it, but she hit those targets and made that role.
She took her inspiration for her military career from meeting Norwegian soldiers and sailors during World War II at Camp Norway. Those sailors and soldiers had come there from Norway when they couldn't go home, when the Nazis had invaded Norway, and they were becoming Royal Norwegian Free Navy. She lived about a block away from Camp Norway. Her father spoke enough Norwegian that he invited a lot of those sailors to their home. And she would have been between 5 and 10 years old, meeting those young men a long way from home, and it inspired her to want to be in the military. So again, it was like that full circle of Lunenburg to a long military career to back to Lunenburg again. After I retired, I moved to Lunenburg. I didn't know when I moved to Lunenburg that Sheila Hellstrom had been born and raised there. Shortly after I moved, my name appeared in the newspaper and I got a phone call. And I probably hadn't talked to her for 15 years at that point. And it was, "Hi Cheryl, this is Sheila. I'm calling you from Ottawa. I just read the local newspaper and I saw your name in the newspaper." And it was just like, wow, you're reading the local newspaper in Lunenburg. Who'd have thought? But she had maintained her subscription in that newspaper throughout her military career and after. She had a subscription to that newspaper for 65 years. She saw my name in it. She called again to offer support. And in that case, I tried to call her ma'am, and she said, "No, it's Sheila." And it was just absolutely lovely. So she had been a role model. She was a mentor, and for me, she was a very important mentor. And she became a friend. There's still things to be done in the military, of course. You will have heard in the news recently some sexual assault situations or harassment accusations, and those have to be looked at as well. And they have to be looked at not just as gender issues, but as human decency issues. And I think that kind of inclusion and diversity is all about what Sheila was about as well, that she didn't just stop at gender integration. She carried on in terms of let's include everybody, let's respect everyone, let's treat everyone well. And by treating everyone well, we'll have a more operationally effective Canadian Forces.
So what's the plan for the artifacts now?
Well, these are going to be on display in the Royal Canadian Legion in Lunenburg. But the main thing is having the Legion have these on display, and they will have her story included in their display of historical military artifacts.
Well, I'd certainly like to thank Cheryl for sharing the story and bringing these items to us today. It certainly has made a whole difference in our understanding of Canadian women's role in the Army, and particularly the Air Force and the Navy. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I think that's the biggest part, is that the legacy continues on, and Cheryl wants to promote that legacy, and I think it should be. It's a celebration of a career person that devoted their life to the Canadian Forces and serving within the forces, and I think that's the biggest marquee that we hold from that.
Coming up on Militaria.
Unfortunately, this gun was a children's toy for most of its life in my family. It was used for Halloween costumes. My name is Bruce McNabb, and I brought in an 1807 Harper's Ferry Flintlock pistol. The pistol is from my father's Uncle Finley, who left it to his daughter Isabel McNabb, and Isabel left it to my father, and my father gave it to me. I'd love to know the history of the gun before it became part of the McNabb family collection 100 years ago.
Most Canadians know the War of 1812 as the one where we burnt down the White House. But beyond that, the details are murky. Even historians debate the root cause of the war. Factors included the British restriction of American trade with France, American expansionism, and the Royal Navy press-ganging British-born Americans into service. 2.5 years of fighting ended with the border between Canada and the US virtually unchanged, and roughly 45,000 people dead. This included soldiers, civilians, and First Nations supporters on both sides. As many combatants died of disease as of war wounds. The only bright spot? Amid the chaos, some 3,000 American slaves escaped. Hundreds settled in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick.
Ken, I brought in a 1807 Harper's Ferry Flintlock pistol. It's been in my family for about a century.
Do you mind if I have a look at it?
No, please do.
Actually, this is what is known as the Model 1805. That's when the guns first came out, and they made them up until 1808. And this one here is dated 1807. That was the year of manufacture. And it's got an inspector there. It's JS, which stands for James Stubblefield. That was the inspector at the time. And they made a total of 4,986, and they made them in pairs. Pairs had the same serial number, so there's 2 1s, there's 2 2s, so on. Now this gun here is 54 caliber with a 10¼ inch barrel. Some parts may be replaced, but the gun looks to be original flint, which is good because a lot of them were converted. But the gun is overall pretty good shape.
Ken, you mentioned these guns were issued in pairs.
Mm-hmm.
Why was that?
Well, that was common during cavalry issue pistols because to reload on a horse was very difficult. So they had an extra shot if they needed it, so they carried the 2 pistols.
So Ken, I'd like to ask you about this gun being involved in the War of 1812.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the most likely
Most likely scenario, yeah, because that would have been the first major war they would have been involved in. Unfortunately, I'm not aware of any records that can identify the serial number to a particular trooper.
Oh, that's too bad.
But they were issued to the cavalry, so the likelihood it did see service in the War of 1812. Where did the gun originally come from, do you know?
Well, no, I don't know. It came from my dad's uncle, so my great uncle, which would have been in the Ontario area.
That would make sense because a lot of the battles were fought in Ontario.
Right, so there's a chance this gun could have been taken from an American soldier in Canada.
Quite likely, yeah.
Yeah, and that's how it ended up in Canada. It's fascinating.
Theoretically, those guns could be used right up into the Civil War. Now, that gun there didn't see that kind of service. So the gun was probably picked up by somebody and kept taken home as a souvenir and stuck in a drawer somewhere. So Bruce, if you can, tell me more about the history of the gun in your family.
It's been in the McNabb family for about a century.
Yeah.
It came from my dad's uncle, Finley McNabb. and we believe it was his wife that brought it into the family. So that would have been in the 1920s. And when they passed away, they left it to their daughter, Isabel McNabb. And she grew up playing with this gun as a toy. It was part of a Halloween costume, and it went to every costume party when she dressed up as a pirate or whatever. So when Isabel McNabb passed away, she left it to my father. And one day we were just chatting about old guns and history and whatnot. And he said, I should give you a gun I have. And that was really the first time I knew he had this gun. And he just hauled it out of a closet and said, you can have it. And I didn't realize it was such a significant part of American firearm history. When I started researching this gun, it was obvious this gun was a legend. The first handgun made by an American government armory. I knew George Washington himself chose the site of that armory. Right away, I realized this gun has a history.
Most of these guns were built in 1807. About 2,500 of them were made in 1807. Andrew Jackson liked carrying them. He had a pair of them and he used them during the Charles Dickinson duel.
Now, apparently, when Andrew Jackson killed his opponent in the duel, his gun misfired, and that should have been the end of the duel, but he asked his opponent's second if he could have another shot.
It stopped at half cock, if I recall. That was a bit of a loophole that you could get around it, because if you fired and it misfired, then that counted as a shot. They had to stand there for your opponent's shot. But because it was a mechanical thing where it didn't fire, then it was considered to be allowed to recock and refire it.
Wow.
Actually, Dickinson shot first and hit him. Jackson had a ball very near his heart all of his life.
Oh, wow, I didn't know
a couple
that.
of ribs, yeah. So the interesting part of that story is, under the rules of dueling, Jackson could have taken the gun, fired in the air, and that cleared the winner. But he chose to shoot and kill Dickinson.
Do you think it was this model gun that he used in the fatal duel?
That's the story, that he carried a pair of them and he used them in that.
Is there any chance this could be one of those guns?
Unless you have some documentation that showed Andrew Jackson owned the firearm, it's all speculation.
Right.
In the collecting world, provenance is a major issue. If you can establish that a particular firearm was owned by somebody famous, then the value of that gun goes up considerably because of the connection to the famous person. So the provenance plays a major role there because it can link to a historical event or an historical individual. The trick is to prove provenance, and it's very difficult.
Have you ever seen this model gun come up for auction? And if you have, what is it worth?
Recent auctions I looked at on these guns, and most of them were for reconversion guns or guns that had replacement cock or something on it. They're running between the $4,000 and $6,000 range.
Okay.
And I see one that was original Flint in really good condition that went around the $9,000 range. They're an iconic U.S. military pistol. It's the first pistol made in an armory.
Right.
So it has that interest, and they're nice looking guns. So they do have an attraction, you know.
Right.
Well, Bruce, this is a very interesting piece. Can I ask you, what are you planning to do with it?
Well, I don't really know, Ken. If it wasn't so valuable, I might build a shadow box for it and just put it on the wall to look at it. It doesn't mean a lot to my immediate family. We would consider donating it or selling it, and maybe if we sold it, donate that money to an outfit that provides dogs for veterans, something to make this come full circle. It was a weapon intended for war, so if we profit from it, we'd want that profit to go back to help a soldier or somebody.
I'd like to thank you for coming in, Bruce. It was a pleasure to meet you, and really a pleasure to see this firearm, and thank you for your time and bringing this in.
Well, good meeting you, Ken, and thank you for all the information.
Anytime.